Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you here with us today for a co-sponsored talk by the Office of International Education in the Department of History on Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, conflicting narratives and nationalisms. We have two guest speakers here today that I'm going to introduce, and then we will turn it over to Dr. Liam O'Mara. And after his short talk, we will also turn it over to Dr. Ahmad Salih. And we hope to have some time at the end for questions. But let me start off by introducing Dr. Liam O'Mara. He's been teaching at Cal State and Chapman universities for over a decade. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of California, Irvine, specializing in Middle East and European history, with his disciplinary focus on the history of ideas and cultures of the Mediterranean basin. His dissertation work addressed the relation between apocalyptic literature and evolutionary biology in 19th century Germany. Dr. O'Mara has contributed chapters and articles on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Arab world, has written and lectured on fascist and populist movements, and is working on a new book about political and national myths in Europe. In addition to his courses on religion, philosophy, and economic history, and his Middle East program at Chapman, he teaches contemporary European and Russian history. He has long been interested in Eastern European cultures, having studied several of the region's languages earlier in life. Dr. O'Mara teaches courses here at Dominguez Hills on European and world history, and each semester focuses on political violence and how we can address conflicts and achieve justice. He lives high in the mountains with his wife and a slew of animals. So welcome, Dr. O'Mara, and I am going to turn things over to you now. Do you need to share the screen?
No, I'll be fine.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so hello and thanks for attending. Thank God this is being recorded since I'll be speaking quickly. The short version is that conflicting historical narratives underlie our readings of this war. No side has been honest, but there are elements of truth in the propaganda, and that makes it both more effective and more dangerous. We should be able to condemn missteps on all sides and not neglect important details of complicity and aggression. The first section here is a record of relations between the United States and Russia through the Cold War and beyond, as I think this is vital to understand the tortured lenses through which both sides view the intentions of the other and the mistakes they make due to a legacy of distrust. The second half, covered within the context of events in Ukraine, is the growth of radical nationalist movements in Ukraine and Russia and how the post-Soviet period has let these thrive with official sanction. Putin is a literal neo-fascist who quotes the work of classic era fascist writers and oversees a corrupt authoritarian regime that uses all the key markers of that ideology. But the Ukrainian government is tied to significant far-right elements and is both tolerated and engaged in violently bigoted actions like pogroms and quasi-apartheid policies, and we'd be dishonest not to acknowledge that. Western media was filled with stories about the threat of far-right politics there until the moment Russian tanks rolled in. Then they shut up about it because Putin was exploiting the issue as a dishonest pretext for invasion. The victims in this war are the people losing homes and lives, not the governments, both of which are corrupt gangster states, both of which are dominated by billionaire oligarchs, and both of which are implicated in war crimes and ethnic cleansing. So it's important to note that discussion of these suggests no sympathy for Russian aims. Their actions in Ukraine are inexcusable. But we cannot pretend the issues do not exist just because a dictator is using them in a power play. Okay, so let's look at US-Soviet relations and their impact in shaping current political discourses. We must first address a dual reality, that the Soviet system created and reinforced a new kind of brutal hierarchy and oppression, and that their system ended a different kind of brutal hierarchy and oppression. Apologists for both tend to focus on crimes of the other and don't like it when you note the darker side of their preferred system. While I'll address some absurd anti-communist hysteria, I must stress that the Soviet system was far from blameless and reproduced many flaws of the state it replaced. Let's begin with the violent antipathy felt toward all forms of socialism by the American capitalist class, the liberal elite, and the media. No matter how it turned out in Russia, there was always going to be opposition to worker power or worker state. And you see that in everything from suppression of labor struggles to perennial support for far-right authoritarian states. We tend to forget, in talking about the Cold War, that the US invaded Russia in 1918 to support anti-Bolshevik forces. The distrust and anger from that had a significant impact on later Soviet paranoia about Western intentions. It is in this context that post-World War II reconstruction should be understood. The Soviets were nervous about US and UK intentions, which wasn't helped by the anti-socialist rhetoric of Churchill or Truman. More than anything else, Stalin wanted to make sure Germany was disarmed and unable again to threaten Russia. In what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War, between 20 and 27 million died, and this followed over 3 million dead in the First World War and 10 million dead in the Civil War. A desire to avoid future conflict was virtually an obsession for Stalin. Many things could have eased tensions and made future conflict unlikely. A second front could have been launched much sooner and more forcefully, perhaps through the Balkans, as suggested by Churchill, which could have eased the Soviet burden. Nuclear weapons could have been dismantled, as suggested by Secretary of War Stimson, and the technology given over to the UN for peaceful purposes. Instead, we lied to Stalin about their existence, tested them in war as a threat, and used them to gain leverage via Truman's atomic diplomacy. And the Soviets could have been granted reconstruction cash, thus linking our economies through trade, tempering each system's excesses and the fears of their leaders. As it stood, the Soviets called Marshall Plan aid economic imperialism, which kind of was. The aid for Western Europe included assaults on organized labor and insistence on liberal capitalism, so Eastern Europe was excluded. None of these seem viable due to domestic political considerations and the realities of power, but had they or then like been pursued, the tensions which erupted in a Cold War could have been avoided. Instead, we had leaders so terrified of the specter of world economic revolution that we got into an insanely costly arms race and dozens of foreign wars and interventions that cost millions of lives. Truman's policy of containment profoundly mistook Stalin's isolationist views, and the so-called domino theory ignored the antipathy between socialist powers to invent a monolithic red menace acting in lockstep to threaten American power. Now, opposition to permanent US involvement in Europe was centered in the Republican Party with its history of isolationism. After World War II, this could not stop our entrenchment in European affairs precisely because of the supposed communist threat motivating groups like the John Birch Society. How could they claim to stand against a monstrous commie threat at home and then step aside as it swept Europe? Such sentiments were already rampant in the Democratic Party as Truman subverted the first Italian election because socialists were polling well. This made a mockery of our claims to back democracy for them. We were okay with it as long as financial markets were okay with it and not if it threatened them. In any event, proto-McCarthyite elements were unable to stop the formal military alliance which took shape as NATO. Rather than focus on peace, we prepared for war because we mistook the paranoia-laced defensive ethos of the Soviets as aggressive on account of its economics. Never mind that Stalin had none of the interest in exporting revolution that had animated Trotsky and Lenin. And worse, from the Russian perspective, the US seemed determined to rearm the Germans and Japanese and link them to the US in defense treaties. So negotiations over disarming Germany and making it neutral continually broke down. And instead, the occupation zones held by the US, UK, and France were unilaterally combined to create the Federal Republic of West Germany. Within a few years, that German Republic joined NATO, and its industrial might became a vital component of American hegemony in Europe. But first, NATO had to be formed through complex negotiations that we included Iceland, which had no military, and Denmark, with its history of neutrality, were telling for the Russians, as both offered bases in the Arctic to hamper Soviet shipping. Those negotiations made it clear that the alliance was not about ensuring democracy so much as ensuring capitalist supremacy, because after all, Salazar's Portugal was a founding member, and its government was a para-fascist dictatorship friendly with Franco's equally para-fascist Spanish dictatorship, which itself was closely tied to the Nazis, and this was not lost on Moscow. Now, as much as NATO provided a framework to defend Europe in the event of future conflict, that it was targeted at the Soviet Union made its creation a partly offensive act. The Soviet economy was as shattered as the rest of Europe's, and even at its height was about the size of the UK's economy, but it turned quickly to rearmament in response, and 6 years later, it created the Warsaw Pact. NATO's genesis and later expansion had much to do with the emergence of what is called the military-industrial complex, famously criticized by one of its architects, Dwight Eisenhower, in his final address as president. The shortest way to define it is to note that before the war, we spent little on arms and had a tiny arms industry, but in its course, we became the largest source of weapons in history. And the corporations benefiting most were determined to keep the cash flowing. And so donations poured into election campaigns, which worked. US spending went up, not down, as seen after all past conflicts. The close relationship between corporate and political elites exposes a difference between the interests of the political class and of regular people. Because, I mean, after all, how does it hurt us if people in an African or Asian country choose socialism? As per Wilsonian rhetoric on self-determination, it's simply not our business. There is a clear difference between the internal affairs of another country and foreign invasion like we're seeing in the Ukraine. Yet even here, there's a long record of hypocrisy in the US and in NATO, as the US imposed governments on Iran, Guatemala, Vietnam, Chile, Iraq, etc., and NATO had no issue intervening in Serbia, Afghanistan, and Libya. And so, in pursuit of dollars for defense contractors and American corporate influence, the principle of self-determination was jettisoned. In fact, the need to secure cooperation led us to bail out bankrupt imperialists and fund their wars to recover colonies. Support for colonialism did much to help the Soviets make inroads in the decolonized world, as they could claim to back liberation struggles while the Americans backed Europe. Racism and anti-communism seemed to trump all else, and we spent trillions subverting both Soviet influence and indigenous socialist movements alike. Much as in the later War on Terror, this was noted by critics like Walter Lippmann as opening a door to limitless spending and endless conflict. This is the root of differing American and Russian perspectives on NATO. It's hard to agree on what it is when there are legitimate differences that are both right from different points of view. Many in Europe and the US were terrified of the Soviet system and did not want it spread by force. Likewise, many in the USSR were terrified of capitalist imperialism and foreign intervention wars and did not want their system toppled by force. Soviet perspectives underlie the current Russian view of NATO, which sees it as an anti-Russian organization. This was reinforced many times by American presidents, and we need to deal with this legacy to understand why Putin says and does what he says and does. Consider how the Cold War ended. Recognizing the Soviet economy was in a shambles and that its repression had bred resentment, Mikhail Gorbachev launched his glasnost and perestroika reforms. Soviet weakness did nothing to curb the enthusiasm of Ronald Reagan for arms buildups, nor stop him from referring to the Soviet Union as an evil empire or joking on a hot mic about bombing them. US triumphalism under both Reagan and the elder George Bush created a unipolar world in which Russia was peripheral, a situation guaranteed to feed a nationalist backlash. The US and Western Europe could have stepped up with massive material assistance and worked to integrate Soviet successor states into the peaceful systems of post-war Europe. As Paul Danieri notes, the United States did not initiate a new Marshall Plan because it was in a recession and an election year. This analysis defends cowardly politicians unwilling to push unpopular policies and ignores the fact that Congress can spend what it likes during a recession as at any other time. It also lets the Europeans off the hook, since they likewise did little with predictable results, a collapse into corrupt gangster states with an inborn antipathy towards the West. Our politicians spend vast sums on wars and little on peace. Consider the cost of backing the Afghan Mujahideen, and that we walked away once the Soviets left, leaving the place a warlord-dominated hellhole right for the Taliban. Some blame for the situation in the former Soviet Union thus falls on us, just as in Afghanistan, since in both we invested countless billions to hurt the countries and then left after achieving a political goal. The Cold War forced the Soviets to spend themselves into oblivion, and when the object of the arms race had succeeded and the Soviet threat gone, the military-industrial complex pushed to sustain and expand spending, not limit it. And it's in this light that we should examine Bill Clinton's decision to expand NATO, since he sold the idea of a temporary dip in defense spending by opening up the prospect of vast riches to arm new allies. It was noted then that NATO expansion would alienate Russians and push them into a paranoid nationalism, and this prediction was sadly borne out. Early in the post-Soviet era, there was a chance to bring Russia in, first as an observer, which happened, and then as a member, which did not. An offer could have knit Russia and the region into the same system and helped to ensure peace in Europe. Alas, that would have required things be taken more slowly with the countries of Eastern Europe who were keen to get in. But a more lengthy process predicated on Russian participation could at least have made clear that NATO was aimed at the Soviet Union, not at Russia. If NATO wasn't simply to be shut down, it needed a new mission. And from Moscow's perspective, that mission was to contain Russia and keep her weak and marginalized. By neglecting the aid needed to rebuild there and instead spending that money to arm former Russian allies in Eastern Europe, we told them that NATO was an anti-Russia organization. The consequences of this missed opportunity are manifold. Russian troops remain today in several post-Soviet territories, from Armenia to the breakaway enclave of Transnistria. Russia cozied up to China and the Central Asian autocracies to create the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Vladimir Putin's path to power was paved in the brutal Chechen War, where his terror tactics reflected a desire to cling desperately to what remained of the old empire. Putin learned that radical nationalism could forge a large enough coalition to replace Boris Yeltsin and dominate Russian politics. Clinton's NATO expansion was followed by other rounds, bringing all former satellites in Eastern Europe into the American camp, along with three former Soviet republics. The latter came in 2004, not long before the 2008 Georgian War, which was sparked by Tbilisi's intentions to join NATO. To ensure no more countries could join the alliance and further erode Russia's sphere of influence, Putin invaded the small Caucasus Republic and created two separatist states in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This made NATO membership impossible, as it would embroil the alliance in a war to expel Russian troops, propping up their independence. This is the same playbook Putin is following in Ukraine's Donbass region. Now let's back up a little. A decade under the corrupt rule of Ukraine's second president, Leonid Kuchma, saw privatization of the economy in favor of oligarchs. We associate the term now with Russia, though to be fair, all billionaires are oligarchs on account of their political influence. But Ukraine has actually produced many of the Russian oligarchs, and its own exert the same malign influence in Ukraine as the Russian ones do in theirs. A ballot in 2004 was marred by allegations of vote rigging in the election of Viktor Yanukovych, and the mass protests of the Orange Revolution brought a rerun election in which Viktor Yushchenko won with 52% of the vote. But in the 2010 election, Yanukovych won in the second round with 48% of the vote. And the next year, he jailed his opponent in that race, former PM Yulia Tymoshenko, who spent 3 years in prison before being cleared by the Supreme Court. Yanukovych's election under the Party of Regions, with heavy support in the Russian-speaking South and East, forces us to address the thorny question of nationalism. So before we go further, let's define it. I blame the media for constant conflation of the words country, state, and nation, which are quite different. A state is a set of institutions like laws, borders, military, etc. A country is a state with sovereign control over land. To illustrate this, consider that the Palestinians have a state in the PA, but no country since Israel controls the land. Finally, a nation is a group of people with common features. These can include language, culture, religion, ethnicity, history, etc. But a nation is the people, not a country. Nationalism is thus entirely different from patriotism because it has a different object. Nationalists fight for a people, patriots fight for a country. Ukrainian nationalism, therefore, can explicitly exclude minorities like the Russian speakers, Roma and Jewish populations, Turks and Tatars, Poles and Romanians, and any non-European immigrants. And it does. Since the fighting picked up again this year, American media has forgotten all about Ukrainian neo-Nazism and neo-fascism. Granted, Russia has the same problems and is led by a neo-fascist dictator, so don't think I'm swallowing Kremlin propaganda. The denazification pretext Putin has used is as false as it gets, but we must address the issue of radical nationalism in this fight. In Kiev, for example, Reconquista is a well-known pub and mixed martial arts club tied to the Azov regiment. So more on them in a moment. The name references wars in Spain to expel Muslim powers and forcibly convert the population. And the reason is plain, given the organizers talk openly about training young white men to kill Muslims and immigrants. Such things are not limited to Ukrainians, of course, as the far right is international in its scope in ways it never was in the classic days of fascism a century ago. Rather than focus on a given national group, many now use the American framing around whiteness and speak of preparing Europeans for a race war against immigrants. Ultranationalist parties have had mixed success in Ukraine, with some expanding into social and cultural spheres, but with more limited electoral success. In 2012, for example, Svoboda took over 10% of the vote despite being a radical nationalist right populist party with a contingent of skinheads and neo-Nazis. It has fallen considerably since and now has just one seat in parliament. Weak electoral support for the far right, is usually around 3%, is sometimes used to dismiss the threat of Ukrainian nationalists, but this misses the point, as these groups are playing the long game and are working to indoctrinate a new generation into ethno-nationalist and neo-fascist politics. I'd like to talk for a moment about language. So let's start with the obvious. Russian and Ukrainian are different. Both are in the East Slavic family, along with Russian and Belarusian, but are as different as Spanish and Portuguese. Upon independence, Ukrainian was made the sole official language, despite much of the population speaking Russian. Indeed, politicians like Tymoshenko and Yanukovych are native Russian speakers who learned Ukrainian for official use. About a third of the country speaks Russian at home, making it a major second language with no official status. In his 2010 campaign, Yanukovych promised to make Russian co-official for regions with substantial speaker populations, and he followed through in 2012 with a new language law. Implementation was blocked when he was driven from power, but it was a polarizing moment for Ukrainian and Russian nationalists who devolved into bitter fighting, including fistfights in the Ukrainian parliament. There's an obvious parallel in nationalist struggles of the former Yugoslavia, where Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks attacked each other viciously despite speaking the same language. The folks there developed identities around a religious difference, resulting in ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war. The parallel is especially potent when we think of the Azov movement, which honors and works with Croatian fascists. Like Ukraine, Croatia is a battleground between the facts and a World War II revisionism that clears Nazi collaborators of war crimes or celebrates those crimes. So back to language. Despite failing to enter force, the 2012 law opened raw wounds which played a part in the Maidan uprising. In February 2013, Kiev signed a law to prepare an association agreement with the European Union, but in November, Yanukovych abruptly suspended work, halting Ukraine's move toward Europe, and canceled a bill to free Tymoshenko. The result was almost 1 million Ukrainians protesting and rioting in the streets. This continued into February, by which point enough of the president's coalition had fled that the opposition could pass bills declaring Yanukovych a traitor and removing him from office. In essence, a coup took place, and even as it did good things like removing troops from Kiev and free political prisoners, a stench of nationalism hung over it, giving Putin his pretext. Folks talk about what started this year as the beginning of a war, but no. Russian troops entered Ukraine in 2014 in response to the Maidan events and have been there ever since. They fought in the country's eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as in the Crimean Peninsula, which was illegally annexed. This highlighted the weakness of the post-Soviet Ukrainian military as it depended upon militias organized by ordinary citizens and on foreign volunteers, and that brings us to Azov. The Azov Regiment formed as a volunteer battalion in 2014. In those fights, it helped to save Mariupol from Russian-backed separatists, but has been rewarded for its service. Foreign-born leaders with neo-Nazi ties were given Ukrainian citizenship. It was elevated to a formal regiment connected to the military, and it was given its own column of tanks. Nowhere else in the global far right do neo-fascists have an armored force, official sponsorship by government, and wealthy backers in the oligarch class. The latter can be seen in some public activities like running Cossack House, a 3-story former hotel in downtown Kiev that is a social center for the European far right. Its doors are emblazoned with a Volksangel symbol, once used by Waffen-SS divisions that terrorized Europe and long connected to the racist right. No other far-right group in Europe operates so openly, is so well-funded, and so open to collaboration as the Azov Regiment and its political party, the National Corps. Though it currently has no seats in parliament, its social influence continues to grow, and its veterans are celebrated as heroes of Ukraine. They even run a summer camp for children where they're indoctrinated in far-right ideals and taught to shoot. In addition, Azov have in the past aided far-right terrorists with members of the International Atomwaffen Division and the California-based Rise Above movement training in Ukraine. Early fruits of the Azov movement can be seen in violent pogroms in 2018 against the Roma population. Multiple attacks in Lviv, Kiev, and Ternopil killed and injured many in Roma camps, highlighting the danger of allowing neo-Nazis to arm and train in public for a race war. Now, granted, such problems exist in other countries, and far-rightists have had electoral success in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere, and Russia has its own problem of far-right paramilitaries with racist groups like the Russian Imperial Movement and its militia acting in transnational operations, and the Wagner Group, a paramilitary tied to Putin for whom it is a private enforcer, allowing plausible deniability for terror acts. The Wagner Group has been involved in the Ukraine war and participated in things like the Bucha massacre, in which 400 civilians were tortured and killed. As so often happens, nationalist crimes inflame nationalist sentiment, inspire crimes by other groups, creating a violent cycle of recrimination, lies, and suffering. Remember the earlier language law that tried to allow Russian at local level? Not only was that dropped, in 2017, Kiev passed a comprehensive new law that reiterated Ukrainian as the sole official language, but allowed smaller minority tongues to be used at the municipal level, like the Galkas Turkic language in southern Bessarabia. But it explicitly rejected Russian, citing a colonial history which had supposedly imposed Russian on Ukraine, and called for phasing Russian out of educational settings. Remember that language is a core component in the self-definition of nations, and the 2017 law can thus fairly be viewed in the context of like a growing reactionary nationalism. And that helps to animate the Russians' own neo-fascist rhetoric. Some of the material I've seen coming out of Russian state propaganda bodies is violently fascistic. They've been publishing, with no hint of irony, calls for the denazification of Ukraine through policies that can only be called neo-Nazi, such as ethnic cleansing, delegitimization of Ukraine's independent character, and a claim that Russia needs to conquer and hold it through a generation of intensive re-education to kill Ukrainian cultural identity. Such rhetoric makes ample use of history, showing again that the Russian framing of events is tied to the past. Their narratives around World War II reject many of the facts, such as that the Soviet Union worked with the Nazis as an aggressor in 39 and 40, conquering Eastern Poland, seizing chunks of Romania and Finland, absorbing Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Victims of the Soviet army and NKVD, its secret police, are included in the death toll of the later Nazi invasion, retroactively pretending the seized territory was Soviet. In this context, we might remember that some radical groups from the countries above, as well as Ukraine, worked with the Nazis during the war from both resentment of Soviet imperialism and from their own nationalistic and anti-Semitic ideals. In Russian memory, evoking Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera offers a kind of justification for their view of Ukraine, given Bandera's on-again, off-again relationship with the Nazis and his genocidal acts against Poles in Western Ukraine. That said, the guy in his movement have been dead since the 50s, but like so much of the past, it still figures heavily in the Russian framing, with state media suggesting Ukrainians pretend to a functional democracy, but are utterly consumed by neo-Nazism. The sad irony is that while Ukrainian and Russian cultures are distinct, the Russian framing presumes cities like Mariupol, Odessa, Kharkiv, and others are Russian, not Ukrainian, and that Ukraine is inseparable from Russia. How politicians in Moscow have quoted Lenin as saying, "There is no Russia without Ukraine," and an irredentist assumption that the two must be unified underlies much Russian doctrine, again showing its supposed anti-Nazi rhetoric disguises its own expansionist goals and genocidal aims. So to wind down here, what can we do if there are neo-Nazis in both Ukraine and Russia and neither side are being open about that? How are we from the outside to understand the danger of conflicting nationalisms and violent ambitions? And how can we address a war that has been raging off and on since 2014 and claim the lives of so many? The simple answer is, I don't know, but I'll say two things. On the one hand, Ukrainians have a right and indeed a moral duty to defend themselves from an imperialist neighbor. On the other, there is real danger in dropping arms in Ukraine, as some will be taken by radical nationalists who will use them against civilians. It's similar to the problem of arming Syrian militias only to see weapons fall to Nusra Front and Daesh and be used in atrocities. How we can best help Ukrainians resist invasion without also helping the far right is tricky given the government's ties to the far right groups. So my goal here has been to complicate the issue a little, to cut through some of the one-sided rhetoric and show this is a lot more complicated than it may seem. One reason is that we need creative thinking to find a way out, and I would invite all of you to contribute to that. And another is to remind us all that media shows a very slanted view of major events, and we need to maintain skepticism if we're to avoid becoming agents of propaganda ourselves. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amaro. That was a lot of ground you covered, very interesting. I'm going to encourage people, if they have questions, to use the Q&A function. That way, Dr. Amaro could look at those and maybe even answer some of those during the time that we have. I'd like to now introduce our second guest panelist, Dr. Ahmed Salih. He's a professor of political science at California State University at Dominguez Hills, who has served in several leadership roles, too numerous to mention here, but currently he is the Associate Dean of International Education and Senior International Officer. Dr. Salih earned a doctorate degree from the University of Southern California in International Relations. His bachelor's degree is from the University of Algiers in Algeria. Prior to joining Dominguez Hills, Dr. Salih was a political analyst and senior writer for Gulf News, the leading English newspaper in the Arab world, and was a columnist for Algerian newspapers El Kabar and Ek Chab. Dr. Salih appears on Algerian national television, Algerian radio, the BBC, China Global Television, and Al Jazeera. Currently, he writes a weekly column for AlgérieDiplomatique.com. And Dr. Salih's academic research is in international politics and comparative politics, with the Middle East and North Africa as his area of study. His work is on the impact of information technology on society, politics, security, and economy in the Middle East and Northern Africa. His various publications include work on security in a digital age, such as Assessing the Theory of Information Technology and Security for the Middle East, that was published in Johan Eriksson and Gianpiero Giacomello's International Relations and Security in the Digital Age. His recent book chapter on the digital divide in scientific development and research, The Case of the Arab World, was published in Anthony H. Normore, another DH colleague, and Antonia Issa Lajera's Crossing the Bridge of the Digital Divide, A Walk with Global Leaders. In this publication, he examines the effectiveness of the building of the IT strategies undertaken by Arab governments in the area of scientific knowledge building as a means to reduce the digital gap in the Arab world. Today, he's going to bring his expertise to give us more to think about and put together with our the work of Dr. Omara earlier today. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Salih.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talamanti and Dr. Umara. I just sent you my PowerPoint presentation. It's only 5 slides, Laura, if you could share it with us. It's a short. So it's really a blessing having Dr. Umara start this panel by giving us a comprehensive overview of the historical roots and the root causes of this conflict. Now, my talk will be focusing on what we don't talk much about, which is peace. There is so much emphasis on this war. There is so much emphasis on the humanitarian casualties. Some have described, for example, as thank you, Laura, as a humanitarian genocide, as President Joe Biden described it. So the focus here will be on that missing link or that missing emphasis, which is in peace. But let's start, let's take a journey and first identify what is this conflict. I mean, everything is happening in the Ukraine, and that's really the theater. But what's happening in reality is more than that. I think the biggest thing about this war, it is a tragedy that the Ukrainian people are suffering, their lives have changed with the refugees all over. But in reality, it's a geopolitical war. It is a war between the United States and Russia. United States is not involved directly, but it is, these are the two main players. In the middle of this, two, there is, or in the midst of all of this, in the background, and we constantly hear this, the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Remember, this is a treaty that was created, and as Dr. Omara eloquently presented, during the Cold War, and its purpose was to stop or to deter the Soviet Union, to protect the Western world from the Eastern power. This was a legitimate institution, and it had a sole purpose of defending Western Europe from the threat of the former Soviet Union. So this is where the issue comes. The first dates you have to remember, again, Dr. Amara talked about it, is 1989, when you have major revolutions in Eastern Europe. And then the biggest one is 1991. In 1989, both those events marked the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Eastern Bloc. Something that Francis Fukuyama described as the end of history, and that of all the system, fascism, communism, and other systems that the world experienced, liberalism, capitalism won. So we won. We ended up being that side of the historical victory. We had subsequently leaders, Western leaders, including George W. Bush, Clinton, and everyone talking about what changed. But nothing has done as a side point about how do we restructure this world now that the Soviet Union is over. But crucial to the Ukraine, there was this business of NATO. What is the role of NATO now that it is, or its mission, now that the main threat is gone? So very briefly, because I know we really wanted to have a discussion, I'll ask you first to focus on the first date, 1992. This is a very important date because this is when the Soviet Union is collapsed, and NATO questions is now emerged. What are we going to do with NATO? In fact, the Warsaw Pact that was created to deter the NATO was also collapsed. So there was no need for NATO. European and the American decided that the new mission of NATO was to combat terrorism. This coincided with the civil war, or what I call the anti-civilian war in Algeria, and the Islamist terrorist organizations become a threat in Europe, particularly in France and Britain. So the threat of terrorism was seriously taken into consideration and tasked the NATO with this mission. Fast forward later came the September 11 and the attack on the United States. And we began a new phase or a new role for the NATO, which was to actually be engaged and beyond the European borders, to go to Afghanistan and become more of a multinational force designed to protect the Western values. So it has more of a value-laden sort of democratic mission that added to what is NATO. And we continued to go in that same theme until something happened in the third day, that's sort of another day that we need to remember, is a summit meeting in Bucharest, 2008. This is a summit meeting where a discussion, a more explicit discussion about expansion of the NATO to include the former Soviet states, Eastern Europe and more. But the issue of Ukraine and Georgia were raised at that point. There was a discussion, a serious discussion, but never written down, as some scholars have shown, that NATO was explicitly aiming at including Ukraine and being in Ukraine and Georgia. But Germany and France opposed the idea, knowing only too well that such an expansion would be interpreted by Russia as a threat against their national interests. So they did not support it. Sorry. I'm trying to see the time, so I leave sometimes for discussion. Okay, now I know where we are. So here we are in 2008 in Bucharest, and the issue is, should we expand, should we include Ukraine or Georgia? The communique, when you read it, doesn't make reference to Ukraine and Georgia, but discussions were raised there, and scholars came to say, it was designed, they were included, and so on and so forth. So we move forward to, and I'm very sort of general, I'm glad Dr. Omara gave us all the details there so you could fill in the things. But came President Joe Biden when he was elected. And here, one of the issues that became very, very interesting is there is this background, these events that are happening in Europe that we don't give too much attention. Number one is that the Russians have grown tired of this, what they interpret as a major problems on their border, meaning that they felt threatened by this idea of continuously pushing Ukraine, or Ukraine wanting to be part of the NATO and the EU. The second thing, there was also within Europe, and which concerns the United States very much, that the Europeans wanted to start thinking about and implementing a new structure to protect their own security. Namely, specifically, a reason for it is that under Donald Trump made it very clear that, look, I don't want to deal with NATO. I'm out of NATO. You take care of your business. So here is Biden come to power, and two things happened. Once, the way we left Afghanistan, it was a disaster. It's a human disaster. And, even the United States didn't even bother to tell their NATO partners that I'm leaving. That massacre, that the way the United States left created really a serious business, a serious issue for the European. And a second, if you remember that submarine thing, there was a business deal to build that the French and were starting to build a nuclear submarine for Australia. The American came in and stepped in and say, you know, they had a secret deal with Britain to steal away what was initially a French business. This is a billion-dollar business to take the business away from the French. The European felt cheated for one of his reasons, is that they thought here is Biden who comes to power. He's saying, oh, cooperation, all transparency, and suddenly he does these things. So that created some kind of sort of worries in the European, and Joe Biden started to lose his credibility in the eye of the European. But then connected to that, there is this other idea that is happening, is that the Germans have this, you know, gas stream that they were building with the Russian. Russia is now very well going to be very integrated in the European economy. That fear of losing Europe to the Russians drove Biden to take the positions he took. So for the first time, if this was not, when you hear Joe Biden, President Biden describing the Russian leader as a criminal, using the language that, you know, amount to sort of you can easily compare it to what we have seen under President Trump, those languages are not diplomatic and would not come from what you call from a president of the United States. So this idea of attacking directly Biden and making him a villain fits with this narrative that Europe, you're facing another type of dictator who is ready to take over your continent. He's a threat, and you need to rally behind the United States to do this. So all of this is what we've seen in the Ukrainians. So you had this negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians, but the Russians specifically know very well that any deals for this negotiation, for a peace resolution, for a resolution of the conflict, of the Ukrainian conflict, has to be between them and the United States. And this is the other one, the slice that you have. The way we place so much talk on NATO, but we also need to remember that the other thing that the Russians fear the most is that the democratization process that happens, if it were to happen in the Ukraine, because the fear that if Ukraine becomes democratic, then that spills over to the Soviet, to the Russian. So that fear of making sure that the Ukraine is neutral is very important. Let me just move straight forward to tell you some of the basic lines for this, so that we could have some discussion. We have so far a few attempts at real negotiations. Attempts at the United Nations have been really more about condemning the Russians than anything else. The European efforts led by Britain, Germany, and France, and along with Turkey, have all failed. And the main reason they failed, because this war is not about Ukraine, it's about United States and Russia, and finding a place or for reasons for why NATO should exist. Laura, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saeed. I want to open it up now for questions. If you can just put those in the chat. For either Dr. O'Mara or Dr. Salih, or for them both.
Do we see the questions there? Oh.
Not yet.
Not yet.
If there aren't further questions, were there any other points that you wanted to follow up on, Mahmoud?
Oh, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, one is we are, You know, it's very, very interesting. This war has affected us in more ways than one. And I think when Dr. Liam talked about, you know, difficult to predict what's going to happen, it's very, very serious. But when you look at the prices that we're paying, I mean, we tend to emphasize only about on the oil prices and all of that stuff. But this is also has to do with, you know, the value of the dollar, the value of the Russian currency. All of these are really connected. For example, we printed money, huge amounts of money to solve during this pandemic. And for a while, people were not spending on that money. Now, when we are coming back, we start to spend. But a lot of that money was not backed in the treasury because it was a fake money. Now you have that factor, and then you have the sanctions that we're imposing on the Russians, and the Russians are saying, "Stop! We are not going to use the dollar. We're going to look for other alternatives." When you look at inflation, for example, before the pandemic or at the top of the pandemic, it was 1.7. It is now 7.9. So the sanctions we impose on the Russians, the pandemic are all connected. So in the end, maybe we became wiser and say, you know, let's stop this nonsense of war, so that we could actually be back into the business of living peacefully. And because it touches, in fact, it is affecting even our pockets. I mean, our way of lives, and I could see it in the market. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We did get a question, and so this is for both of our panelists today. Did Putin expect some in the Donbass to receive Russian forces as liberators?
It's hard to say what anyone would really expect, but it's actually been a relatively small chunk of the overall population there that has. But there is a small portion of the population in both Luhansk and Donetsk that are welcoming the Russians, but many, many more, even the Russian speakers, do have a Ukrainian identity. And much of the Russian-speaking population in the East, it really is worth noting, and I think a lot of people don't know this, they're not Russian in the sense of like a longer term Russian ethnicity. They're simply Russian speakers. They're families that had adopted the Russian language. Many of them would consider themselves to be ethnic Ukrainian. And a lot of those people who consider themselves to be ethnic Ukrainians who happen to speak Russian really just rather their government sort its crap out and respect their language use, and not, you know, wanting to be like annexed. And certainly I think almost no one in either of those territories, and it's difficult to know for sure, obviously, until long after we can do really good polling or whatever here. But based on the kind of reports that are coming out on the ground from people, there's very little support for the idea of puppet regimes, you know, the kind of like, you know, people's republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. And because people have already seen, especially too, what's happened in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they're essentially just annexed to Russia with a kind of on paper independence. And I don't think that's desirable to most people.
Thank you, Dr. Amar. We've got a few more questions now. So do you think that if U.S. agreed not to include Ukraine in NATO, this war would have happened? I'm going to turn that one to Dr. Salih.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, also you have to know that not just the EU, NATO, but also the EU, the European Union, because the European Union also includes NATO. So in other words, you have to be very, very careful. When this crisis started, some of us who are looking at it from far away thought that Ukraine has the answer, meaning that Ukraine could come and say, you know, I'm not going to be involved. I'm not be part of the Ukraine, and I'm of NATO or EU, but Ukraine will use its advantage to take to benefit from its neutrality. The problem, those who study the buffer states will be is also very problematic, because as scholars notes, buffer states tend to be sort of at the mercy of what the big superpowers, how they will treat them. So both the United States and Russia would see Ukraine as a way to influence it and to see to it that it's on our side. When you look at the systems or the president that have sort of have we seen in Ukraine, pro-presidents, pro-Russia's president have been sort of had good relationship with Russia. Those who were not had bad relationships. So the short answer, Ukraine could solve this by just saying, I'm not going to be a member, but could they? And the question is that where the United States play a role in influencing Ukrainian politics.
Thank you. Dr. O'Mara had a follow-up to the question about the Donbass that I sent to him, if you want to answer that one now. And then Dr. Salih, there's a question in the chat about US and Western countries being promised, Boris Yeltsin being promised that Russia can join NATO. So we'll come back to you on that one in just a moment. Dr. O'Mara.
I didn't think we'd come back to the same, so I typed something out in the little Q&A a second ago. I don't think that Putin really would have realistically expected to be seen as a liberator. I think the thing that's most surprising there is just how united Ukrainians really were in terms of stiff resistance and just how badly his own forces have performed. Realistically, they should have known better because there were like drunk tank crews in 2008 in the Georgian War who were abandoning their equipment. So a lot of the failings that we've seen in the fighting in Ukraine really come down to the collapsing professionalism in the Russian army. And I think that he's massively overestimated his force and underestimated the resistance in Ukraine. But I really don't, so yes, he definitely made a major tactical error there, but I don't think it's because he expected to be greeted as a liberator, and more because he expected he could quickly paste Ukraine enough to seize those territories, because the Georgian War was over still in a few days. I mean, his forces did terribly, and it was still over in a few days because Georgia didn't fight hard on it, and the Ukrainians are.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Salih, back to the question about Russia being promised to join NATO.
I really am not aware if they were promised. Could be some discussions in that regard, but I would really sort of see it problematic in a sense, particularly from the Americans. I think the United States, be it under Clinton, particularly Clinton, under Obama, Obama was really more visionary. Obama understood the geopolitical consideration and did not want to antagonize the Russians for fear it would be sort of they would be engaged in what we've seen today. Inviting them to NATO would really defeat the purpose. Maybe the idea that they may come and join forces in combating terrorism, corruption, or other things. But that's really, I have to check it. I'm not aware that they would. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for addressing it as best you could. A good response. There's one, I think we'll end with this one and get both of your perspectives. There's a question in the chat. How do you think the actions, Russia postponing its actions in Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014, and then restarting just in 2022, change the geopolitical situation? I don't know who wants to go first. Was that clear? It's in the chat if you want to take a look at it.
So yeah. I could give it, Dr. Leah, shall I go, Dr. O'Mara?
If you'd like, you started.
All right. So 2014 is a very, very important date. Why? Because now we start to see that the Russians are reacting to what was happening with this with NATO expansionism, with this idea that, that Russians are aggressive and they do all of the things. And we tend, we have this political culture in our system that Russians are, red and communism is bad and they are there to do harms to us. That is very, very significant. But when you look at the planning that happened from 2014 to 2022, and the Russian at that point started to think about protecting their security the way they know best, using a military force, interventionism, you have all of that. And that is what sort of, you look at how they responded to the economic crisis. For example, the ruble is now almost at the value that it was before the sanctions happened. They are not as much affected. Whatever the media tells us, you have to go and read between the do the extra reading to get the image. They've been preparing for this. Some breathing they got from when President Trump took over. President Trump friendship with Putin and his position of NATO, the Russians come to believe that had Donald Trump won the election the second term, he would withdraw from NATO and then they would be safe. Now, Biden changed the whole equation, and part of it is really to act, to portray themselves, or Biden to portray himself as he's not a Trump. And the second thing is to somewhat come back and correct the mistakes that Obama made when he did not stand against Putin previously. And that's why a lot of these things become more of a psychological saving face formula, that the end of the war may be by giving both sides a way out of it. If Biden loses this war, the elections are over. He has to come out a winner, and he has to have a saving face formula to get out of that. And the same thing with Putin.
Thank you. Dr. O'Mara, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I'd say that hits a lot of the main points there, because the elections really do play a big part in that. Honestly, early on, in terms of the Russian intervention in eastern Ukraine, they went out of the way to disguise it. There were Russian troops on the ground, but they took off Russian insignia so they could pretend that they were paramilitaries, and then working with the Ukrainian paramilitaries in the area to try and make it look like it was a real separatist movement, which for the most part it was not. That status quo may have continued for some time as a kind of low-level thing, just as a way to, because really all you need is a complicating situation to stop Ukraine from moving into NATO. And he accomplished that already with the annexation of Crimea. So, NATO membership was sort of off the table at that point for Ukraine. It was going to be indefinitely deferred until that situation was solved. But putting Biden in office and the much more muscular approaches to NATO changed the calculations. I think that Putin was initially hoping to avoid a significant conflict in NATO, in Ukraine, just because the Russian military really is not well suited for conventional warfare. It's not. It's had a hard time affording rearming effectively for this kind of fight, and you've seen that in the very high casualty rates, relative to the Ukrainians early on. So I think, the election is the major force there. If Trump had won a second term, regardless of whether we left NATO or not, the status quo probably would have continued indefinitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I know that we all learned a great deal. It's really good to have that longer historical context, right, to understand all the complications that we can in this amount of time, right, and to be critical thinkers about how we take what we read in the newspapers and hear in the news in general. And you certainly gave us all a lot of information to think with about where this is going and its impact on different parts of the world. Love to have you back in the future. Hopefully it wouldn't be for this topic, but it certainly is good to know that we have this expertise on our campus. And so thank you so very, very much. Thank you to the students, the staff, the faculty, and the administrators who joined us today. And we'll look forward to sharing it out with the larger campus. So thank you, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing the Dr. Talamandi. Pleasure meeting you, Omar, Dr. Omar.
Thanks much, man. Pleasure meeting you.
Yeah.